Today you're going to learn how to program awesome arpeggiated sounds in MainStage 3 just like this. Hey everyone, I'm David from Sunday Sounds, where we focus on making software like MainStage 3 fun and easy to use for worship musicians like you. Today we're going to do a dive into using MainStage 3's Arpeggiator plugin. This can be a really intimidating and confusing plugin to use, but we're going to walk you through everything you need to know to find success. Now, the arpeggiated sounds that you just heard are all featured in our Sunday Keys template for MainStage 3, and I wanted you to hear an example of these sounds so that you would know what the Arpeggiator plugin is capable of. If you'd like to learn more about Sunday Keys, I'll put a link in the description of this video. Now, I have our Sunday Keys template open today, but we're going to be starting from scratch. Before we dive in, if you're a worship keys player, make sure that you subscribe to this channel, especially if you want to learn how to make MainStage, Ableton Live, and software like that work for you. All right, so within Sunday Keys, let's just go ahead and start from scratch. We're going to create a brand new patch. I'm going to drag it up here to the top of my patch list. So even though we're within Sunday Keys here, the process is going to be the exact same no matter what MainStage concert or template you're working within. Now we're going to add a channel strip, specifically a software instrument channel strip. And then we're going to load in the EXS24 sampler instrument plugin. Go down to Factory, Synthesizers, Synth Leads, and choose this Basic Synth. This is a pretty loud preset, so I'm going to bring the volume down some. This is what it sounds like. All right, something really dry so we can really hear what the arpeggiator is doing and how it's affecting this sound. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this plugin here. And now we're going to add an instance of the arpeggiator. This goes into the MIDI effects area, which is actually above the instrument plugin on the channel strip. So hover over an empty slot, click, and then choose Arpeggiator. So this here is the main panel of the Arpeggiator plugin. There's several tabs here: the pattern tab, options, keyboard, and controller. And we're not going to dive into everything the arpeggiator can do in detail in this video because it'd be way too long, and there's a simpler way to learn about all these functions. Simply go up to Help in the toolbar, choose MainStage Effects, and then there's a bunch of thorough written text documentation provided by MainStage about all the functionality that's a part of the Arpeggiator plugin. We're going to do a general overview and give you some examples of the types of sounds you can create in this video. Right up here at the top, we have the play button. When this is disengaged, the arpeggiator is off. When it's engaged, the arpeggiator is on. Just to the right of that, we have the latch button. If that button is pressed, then all the notes that are in the pattern are just going to be latched and continue to play. By default, latch is toggled on and off by the sustain pedal. So I'm pressing my sustain pedal right now, and as long as I'm doing that, latch is turned on. When I release the sustain pedal, latch is turned off. You can adjust this in the controller tab by making sure that 64 sustain is set to latch. If you don't want this functionality, then just set the destination to none. For most use cases of live performance, this is a really useful feature to have. Now we're going to go back to the pattern tab. You can see as I play notes, they show up here in the pattern area. I'm playing 4 notes, and there's 4 notes on screen now. Bring the volume down just a bit there. As many notes as I play while latch is being held, they're all added to the note array. If I release the sustain pedal and I still hold a few of the notes, then the array goes back down to just the currently held notes. I can adjust the rate of the arpeggiator here. I can make it faster or slower. To the right of that side in the note order section, we can choose how the notes that are being played into the arpeggiator are played back out. So this is an upward order, downward, up and then down, ascending and descending at the same time. And then you have a random order. And then this last order option, which has the hand, allows you to determine the order by actually pressing it and then playing the notes in the order that you'd like them to play back. Now, this isn't as useful as it might sound because it only lets you set that order one time, and then that interval relationship is spanned across the entire keyboard. So you can't set it for a specific chord or note and then set a different order for a different sequence of notes. It just applies globally to that patch. So if you need really advanced MIDI sequencing, the arpeggiator won't do that for you, but we do have a couple tutorial videos over on our website on how to do MIDI sequencing if that's something you need. Most of the time, I find myself in one of these other more commonly used note order options. Within each of these options, you have 4 variations, and you can add additional octaves on top, up to 4 octaves. And each of those different note order options has 4 distinct different variations. So there's actually a ton of different patterns and feels that you can get just by adjusting the note order and the variation. Now, so far we've been in what's called live mode, which you can see here under pattern. That just means whatever is played in is captured in the note array live and then played back based off the note order, the rate, the variation, and the octave setting. Here we have grid mode. This is where you're actually able to draw in the arpeggiator pattern that you'd like on the grid that we see here. You can adjust the length of the grid with this grab bar down here at the bottom. So this is a 16 note grid. We could shorten that all the way down to 1 if we wanted. And you can actually increase the length of the grid all the way up to 64 as well. And the subdivision of each of these steps in the grid is determined by the rate. So right now we have 16 beats in the grid, and each of those represents 1/16th note. So right now, if I just play, we're gonna see 16 16th notes. So a whole bar in between that one note being played. So I can click here on any of the numbers that I'd like to start to add steps to this pattern in the arpeggiator. This blue bar represents the velocity of that step. So if I click and drag it down, that reduces the velocity of that step. If I drag it up, that increases the velocity. Now, what the velocity does to your instrument plugin is going to vary based on the settings inside of that plugin. So it may get louder or quieter, darker or brighter, all depending on the sound that you're using inside of MainStage. If you're not sure how to set that up, the help guide in MainStage is the place to go to understand how to have your instrument plugins affected by parameters like velocity. We can also click and drag this blue bar to the right to have this note hold out for more than that one beat. Otherwise, these notes are staccato and they only last for that one beat. So if we wanted to, we could drag all of these out so that the note length would be a little bit longer. And if you need to remove a note from the grid, you just click on that number again for it to go away. I'm going to bring this down to 4. Now, so far we've only talked about how to play individual notes per grid, but oftentimes you're going to want to trigger full chords. And this is really simple to do. All you do is hit this little chord icon below any of the individual steps. So in this scenario, we're going to have a chord held out for 2/16th notes and then 2 individual notes played immediately after. And we can adjust the variation and the octave range. Everything in the note order area is still able to affect what happens in grid mode. Now, if you've got a sequence that you really like, you can actually save that pattern and then you can recall it on any other arpeggiator patch that you'd like. And there's also a ton of built-in patterns that you can load in that can give you some really interesting ideas for different stuff that you can attempt. So if you need some inspiration, if you want to learn about different ways that you can use this plugin, then loading in these factory pattern presets is a great way to go. Now, here in the Options tab, you have the ability to add a little bit of randomness and some fine-tuned control over the way that the pattern plays back. You can adjust the note length and you can randomize the note length. Adding a little bit of randomization is a great way to avoid that machine gun effect of this note just hitting back exactly the same over and over. If it sounds a little bit too robotic, then adding in a little bit of this random modifier is a good idea. You can do the same thing with velocity. So if this is set to 100%, then whatever you play into the arpeggiator is the velocity that's going to be sent out. On the opposite side, if you bring this all the way down, then whatever you designate inside of grid mode is what's going to be played back. You can also randomize the velocity a little bit. So randomizing the note length and the velocity can both help to humanize this pattern a little bit. Then you have the amount of swing. That's the space between each of these beats. 50% is going to be static. But you can increase this by percentages to add swing to the way that these repeats happen. And if you need some examples of how this plays out, I recommend that you get into MainStage's factory pattern presets because there's all sorts of different swing feels. If you're not sure if your song needs swing and it's a modern worship song, there's a pretty good chance that it doesn't, because most songs have a pretty flat subdivision. So most of the time, 50% is going to be where you're going to want to go. I'm not going to dig into the keyboard tab too much except for this input snap setting right here. This input snap option by default is likely going to say link to rate. And this means that when MainStage's clock is running, it's going to sync your arpeggiator to the next beat of that clock. And that can be really useful if MainStage is your metronome source. But this gets to be a really big problem that makes it almost impossible to sync up your arpeggiator sounds if MainStage's clock isn't running, or if you use an external click source like Ableton Live or an app running on an iPad or something like that. So if you're not the clock source in MainStage, you need to make sure that you change input snap to none. This means that the arpeggiator will start based off your very first note press. So anytime you fully release the keys and fully release the sustain pedal, the clock just isn't running. And then the next time you play a first note, the clock will snap to that input. So this makes it possible for you to sync up arpeggiators with third-party clock sources really easily. It's kind of a hidden feature, so I feel like it's worth calling out here because a lot of folks that use MainStage aren't actually operating as the clock source. And then lastly, here in the controller tab, you can designate what you want different MIDI controls to do. Like we already talked about, by default, you're going to want to set sustain to control latch, which allows you to essentially sustain arpeggiated sounds in the same way that you would sustain a piano or a pad sound. There's lots more that you can do here, but a basic level is just being able to latch via the sustain pedal. So that's a little bit about how the arpeggiator plugin works. Up here at the top, lastly, I'm going to talk about this mode option. By default, your mode might be set to transpose. This is actually a really glitchy setting in MainStage. It's really hard to explain what it does, but it's going to give you really unreliable performance, especially when you're playing a lot of different notes over time while holding down your sustain pedal. So there's two different modes that I recommend. Either add mode, which means that whenever new notes are received, they're added to the existing array of sounds or notes that have already been captured by the arp, or reset mode. What reset mode means is that when you play some notes, they're captured, and then if there's a little bit of a little bit of pause in between, then you play some new notes, the arpeggiator is actually going to discard the original notes in favor of the new ones. This works really well if you're a little bit heavy-footed on your sustain and you want to be able to change to different chords without having to be super conscientious about making sure that you do a clean break, because the arpeggiator is just automatically going to forget those old notes in the old chord and jump to the new one. This is also really helpful if you plan on playing lead parts in your right hand while also having an arpeggiator playing, because you don't want all of those notes from the lead necessarily being present in the array in the arpeggiator as well, because that can get pretty messy. So just depending on your context, reset mode or add mode can both do the trick. You can try out both and see what makes the most sense for you. All right, folks, leave a comment and let us know what your favorite ARP pattern that you discover inside of the factory presets is. And if you have questions, let us know in the comments. We'd be happy to help. If you need sounds just like this one done for you, then click the link in the description to check out our Sunday Keys template for MainStage. It makes it easy to sound awesome and have fun inside of MainStage 3. Thanks for watching.